Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me for part 2 of our story tonight. So before we get started, go and get yourself a lovely hot cup of cocoa, or if you're in a cooler climate or the weather is hot where you are, go and get something refreshing to drink, because part 2 is very exciting. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's continue with part 2 of our story. I pulled a face at my sister, as if to tell her I knew the game she was pulling. And she stuck her tongue out at me. Honestly, that sister of mine could be so desperately annoying. And there were times I rued the day that she actually was my sister. And this was clearly one of those times. I was heartily relieved to finally get out of our house and away from my mother's oppressive nagging and my sister Angie's relentless duplicitous games that ensured she would remain permanently lazy, probably spending the rest of her slovenly God-given days duping my naively ignorant mother so as to avoid lifting a finger around the house. So invariably any tasks my mother needed doing would ultimately be given to me. That was the sad story of my life. But outside of the house I could forget about all that, for I had bigger fish I wanted to fry this afternoon, and the thought of what I needed to do lifted my spirits exponentially. If my mother had a bird's-eye view of my thoughts right now, she would have a hissy fit, that was for sure. But what she didn't know would never ever hurt her. I think Lassie was extremely pleased to be out of doors as much as I was, in the fragrant fresh air, where the traces of petrichor after the rain could be easily smelt in the air, and away from that burst of indignant tension that had been exhibited by my cantankerous mother. Having said that, what dog does not appreciate a jolly good walk? Lassie was no exception to that rule. By all accounts, you only had to say the word walkie to Lassie. She'd know exactly what you were saying. She'd ebulliently charge to the door with an unbridled enthusiasm, her blonde tail wagging furiously. Sadly, on many occasions that lethal tail of hers had done serious damage around and about our home. Another fact that Gertie would always be quick to point out. For a start, my mother's favourite glass coffee table had been ruthlessly shattered by Lassie's tail, which had left my mother less than amused. And then on another occasion a couple of my mother's decorative expensive vessels, made out of the finest porcelain china, that were an artful display on the coffee table, had been vandalized and rambunctiously flung across the living room with the brute force of Lassie's dexterous tail, only to break up into hundreds of pieces. Needless to say, the cost of those damages had all but come out of my pocket money. As I was casually sashaying down the street with Lassie at my side, I was charged with a feeling of great enthusiasm. I couldn't wipe the big grin off my face. I was hoping my plan for the day would work, and I was almost certain that it would. I was pretty sure that Jetski would be at the doggy park at this time of the afternoon, escorted by his devoted owner, Mr. Lehman, on his leash, and I knew that Jetski would take one sniff of Lassie and would be all over my dog like a hot rash. I was certain of it. I knew without any doubt that Mr. Lehman, much like myself, would be equally as thrilled as I was to see his dog inseminating Lassie, who I was certain had come into season. It would just mean I'd have to keep all the other male dogs away from Lassie at the park, but I was pretty sure most of them had been neutered by their owners, so even if they were to mount Lassie, they'd not be able to sire any of her puppies, which was a huge relief. It was a blissfully radiant afternoon in July, when ultimately the sunset would only occur at about 8:30 in the evening, so there was still plenty of sunshine left on this day in our tranquil green leafy neighbourhood of Chestnut Hill in Philadelphia, where our house was among many in a series of row houses along the street, all that looked remarkably alike. So people had done everything in their power to make their own houses look uniquely different from their neighbours', as everybody naturally embraces their own kind of individuality and likes to put their own special mark on their home. Some people had changed the colour of their front door, or put plant boxes in the front windows that had been placed strategically in a showy position so that a tumble of showering red geraniums could add a splash of colour or curb appeal to their homes. Our house proudly distinguished itself from many in our street, It boasted a bright red front door, which looked opulently smart in its deportment, and everybody said as much. My mother had chosen to paint our door a glossy red colour, as she had got hold of a book on Chinese feng shui, whatever you choose to call it. I can never actually pronounce these Chinese names terribly well, nor do I know much about some of their unorthodox practices, but my mother swears by them and believes these nonsensical rituals are actually true and should be taken very seriously, as the beliefs go back for thousands of years. I fiercely believe that if feng shui advised a person to wear a pink sweater every day of your life, that's exactly what my mother would do, as that was how devout she was in regards to some of these practices. According to my mother, the Chinese believe the energy in the layout of rooms affects the positive flow of things in your life, and if things are positioned incorrectly, it can cause energy blockages that can bring about problems and even disease in your life. Under no circumstances, for example, are you allowed to leave your loo seat up, or your prosperity will be flushed down the toilet. If me or my father committed a dreadful offence such as this, which we had both been guilty of doing from time to time, my mother would be on at us like a fisherwife from Billingsgate Fish Market. Her voice would go up several decibels and turn into an indignant squawk, and we would be subject to a long lecture about how much money we would lose that month because we had carelessly left the loo seat up. So my dad and I quickly learnt there were some offences not worth our while committing, and this was clearly one of them. "Love," my father would say, rather diplomatically, raising one of his sceptical bushy eyebrows. "Aren't you taking all this feng shui stuff a little too seriously? You've rearranged all our furniture. It's all over the place. I barely recognise our home anymore. And you get grievously upset if everything is not located in a perfect position. Isn't all this a little over the top, perhaps?" "Pete, for goodness sake," my mother would say, looking affronted. "I would appreciate it if you didn't lecture me on something you know absolutely nothing about. I've been studying feng shui, you know, and the Chinese have been doing this energy work for thousands of years. They're very particular about every building that is erected in mainland China and in Hong Kong, as it happens. They need to ensure it faces the right direction and that the energy flow is positive. So they know exactly what they're doing, because they're desirous to attract good fortune and prosperity into their lives. And I, for one, want to adopt these same principles in our own home, for the benefit of us all." My father knew when to shut down his arguments, as he was determined to keep the peace, so winning an argument with my mother, unless you were Gertie, was close to impossible. So my father let my mother obsess over this feng shui nonsense of hers, as much as she liked. So he became, like me and my sister, a silent observer, so to speak, secretly mocking some of these absurd practices. It was only Gertie who got away with telling my mother how ridiculous it all was. "Honestly," she said to my mother, "I cannot believe you've changed your furniture, moved it around the place like this. I liked everything the way you had it before. This is nonsensical. And you've done this because of some Chinese belief. It's very strange. If the Chinese got everything right, you know, they'd be running the world by now." "They almost are, Gertie," my mother had said in response. "Look at the success they've had in the world. They're the one superpower that has contributed exponentially to the global economy. And if we're not careful, one day in the future, they might actually run the show." "Well, I certainly hope that will never happen," said Bertie, waving her hand in disgust at the very idea. My mother continued to follow the feng shui practices to the letter, with a biblical enthusiasm. She had learnt that red was an auspicious colour, that not only to wear it in your workplace, but also to introduce it into your home. It would seem painting your front door red attracted prosperity into your life, along with introducing red into your home in the form of scatter cushions or throws, was also a way of bringing in favour. Alas, I don't think our financial fortunes changed dramatically after our door was painted postbox red. But I liked the colour, so I wasn't complaining. I've always been pretty partial to red. I like vibrant colours, and even Lassie wore a red collar on my mother's insistence, as red was so very lucky. My father thought my mother painting our front door bright, flamboyant red was going a step too far. but he boringly always preferred more muted, nondescript tones of colour anyway. I actually thought our front door was the most splendid door among all the row houses, and many people complimented us on how good it actually looked, and honestly, it really did look terrific. We were incredibly blessed to have so many accessible parks in the local area, and whenever I took Lassie to the doggy park, I believe Lassie had a taste of doggy heaven. She was introduced to all species of dogs, from sausage dogs to Great Danes, and the varieties seemed as endless as the flavours of ice cream you get at a local ice cream parlour. Often when I went to the doggy park, I was introduced to yet another rare breed. You name it, the park boasted a hive of every kind of dog imaginable to man. And for Lassie, being social with other dogs was a wild, very exciting adventure for her. She was well socialised and got on well with every dog that had a wagging tail. My mother was of course right about jet ski and my ulterior motives for going to the doggy park that afternoon, even though she probably didn't actually know it. I knew that the stunningly handsome Labradoodle would be a very agreeable father to Lassie's pups, and both Lassie and jet ski had the most awesome temperaments that I hoped would be inherited by Lassie's offspring. If jet ski mounted her at the park a few times, I was pretty certain Lassie would be impregnated with his highly sought-after sperm. Once she was on her way to having half a dozen puppies, my mother wouldn't be able to do a damn thing to stop it. She'd probably notice Lassie getting fatter and would blame me for feeding her too many titbits under the table. And then one day Lassie would behave strangely as she looked for a nesting place in our home. And then voila, one by one the puppies would pop out of her like sausages in a processing unit. I'd pretend that I'd absolutely no idea how Lassie had got pregnant. I would plead complete ignorance on the matter. I knew the puppies would be so adorable that they'd go like hotcakes to owners clamouring to get their hands on one of these delightful pups, but I'd make absolutely certain they went to great homes. I knew my dog Lassie would make a fabulous mother. She really did deserve to enjoy the joys of motherhood. I also knew underneath the layers of my mother's so-called tough veneer, she really was a pussycat. I suspected once the puppies had been born, much like my mother had behaved when Lassie came into our lives, she'd be smitten by the puppies. She'd be oohing and ahhing about how wonderful they were. On this unassuming, beautiful day, I had no idea that in a few moments my world would be completely shattered, and that I would always regret taking Lassie for a walk in the late afternoon. The sky was a cornflower blue colour, without a single fluffy white cloud in sight, even though it had rained a lot during the morning. All the trees that lined our pavement rather grandly were like an army battalion of tall, lofty, distinguished-looking soldiers that were ablaze with shiny green leaves, while lawns and people's closely packed front yards were green and manicured. I hasten to say that many people living in the Chestnut Hill area here in Philly seemed to be unfathomably blessed with green fingers, as some of their yards were enviably as close to perfect as you can possibly get, and certainly deserved a front cover spread in a glossy magazine. My mother, on the other hand, was sadly not one of those fortunate people that happened to be blessed with nimble green fingers that could turn a yard into a work of art, although, believe me, she tried on numerous occasions to turn our front yard into the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, but with very little success, despite her very best efforts. It would seem, for some unexplained reason, any of my mother's seedlings she planted would always die on her, so our front yard boasted the most hardy of perennials that were resistant to dying, so even my mother could not cause them undue damage. As I steadily walked down the street, I whistled a happy tune to myself, while Lassie trotted at my side. As usual, her curious, very interested nose was devotedly pinned to the ground, as she tried to tune into the secret, mysterious world I know nothing about, laced with all kinds of scent signatures that only a savvy dog can understand. I've often fancied becoming a dog for a second, and experiencing the world through a dog's nose. I dare say it would be a fascinating experience, although I do believe that some things dogs put their noses into I personally would rather not smell, but I won't go into that now. Old Mrs. Trellis from number 38 was in her yard. She was wearing a huge oversized straw hat with the largest rim that covered her face that I'd ever seen. She was dutifully attending to some roses with a bottle of spray in her hand. It had rained earlier in the morning, and I suspected she was spraying the roses again to protect them from being decimated by the ever-increasing beetle population that descended on the plants at night, usually during the witching hours, with a vengeance. Mrs. Trellis complained bitterly that the rose beetles in her yard were aggressively destroying all the green leafy foliage on her roses. One night she had stood vigil over them, snapping up as many beetles as she could and locking them up in a glass jar, where she disposed of them all with a simple flush of the toilet, and she had felt a great sense of triumph over having killed so many of the little buggers. On one occasion she informed me that she had caught over 86 beetles in one night. I think Mrs. Trellis was in her 80s, although I wasn't entirely sure about that, because my mother always told me it was extremely rude to ask people their ages. I think the real giveaway for me, to her advancing age, was that her posture was slightly stooped. Her skin was crepey and covered in a road map of fine lines and wrinkles, and her hard-working hands were covered in brown spots, caused from sun damage. But despite everything, even at 14 years old, I thought old Mrs. Trellis was in remarkably good shape for her age. She seemed oblivious to the hot sun that was beating down on her back unabashedly. I will admit there was quite a blinding glare on this beautiful afternoon. The sun reflected light off the people's car bonnets, those that were parked in the street, that is. Mrs. Trellis looked up at me from beneath the brim of her large hat, where a couple of artificial roses and a pretty scarf had been carefully pinned. She looked at me through crinkled, pale blue eyes that sparkled with humour. I could see she was very pleased to see me. She was humming away happily to herself when she looked up at me and said, "Going for a walk, are we, Jack? It's a bit late in the day for you, isn't it, dear? I normally see you walking Lassie earlier on in the day, when you come back from school, so this is a tad unusual for you. I never see you or Angie around at this time of the day, although I dare say Lassie will welcome a walk any time." "You're right," I said. "A walk is a walk for Lassie. But you're right, Mrs. Trellis. I don't normally walk Lassie at this time. This is the exception to the rule, I'm afraid." "Well, I thought as much," she said. "So why today of all days, Jack?" she asked me, looking curious. "Well, I had so much homework to do," I confessed. "I decided to do my work first to get it over and done with, but it took so much longer than I'd anticipated. I think it was an essay I had to write about a picnic that gobbled up all my time. I'm not creative, you see, and I'm useless at writing imaginary stories. Let's just say Mum's not best pleased with me. She said I should have taken Lassie for a walk first thing when I returned home from school. I usually do, and then I do my homework later on. But it's not always that plain sailing." I knew, of course, I was not entirely telling Mrs. Trellis the truth, but I was hardly going to broadcast to all and sundry that I was fully intending on getting Lassie impregnated at the doggy park by what I hoped would be an enthusiastic, over-amorous jet ski. Some secrets are best just not shared. "Oh, you poor thing," said Mrs. Trellis sympathetically. "What is wrong with teachers these days? Unscrupulously giving their students a ton of homework to do. Over the weekend, of all things. Back in my day, teachers were never like that, you know. I think we had it a whole lot easier than you kids today. But then we finished our studies at school, returning home with barely any homework at all. The way I see it is that these teachers, or ambassadors of education, so to speak, if you can call them that, should be absolutely ashamed of themselves. Don't you do enough work during the school week as it is, only to be burdened with yet more work when you return home? It makes no sense to me. A good teacher doesn't need to send the kids home with more work. You get enough of it during the week, surely." "That's exactly what I think," I told Mrs. Trellis. "We work hard at school, and then we have to work hard when we come home. These teachers, they never ever give us a break. But on the plus side, Miss Trellis, at least they're making more work for themselves, because they have all that marking to do, and I'm glad of that." "Never mind, dear. I suppose these teachers think they know what they're doing, but I beg to differ on that. Some of the greatest lessons in life that shape our characters are the lessons that happen outside the classroom. My father used to tell me that, you know, when I was a girl growing up. He said all the things that had made him successful in life were never lessons he learned from a teacher at a school, but lessons he learned from the real world. And it's absolutely true in every sense of the word.
Even when I look back at my own school days, what did I really learn back then? I suppose I learned how to apply myself to studies, to read and write, that sort of thing. But what I learnt in the real world, some of those lessons were not easy, let me tell you. But it was a whole different thing altogether.
Well, I'm only 14 years old, Mrs. Trellis, and I don't have much life experience, so to speak, but I would say your father is onto something there. It kind of makes sense to me. I often think lots of stuff I learn at school is pretty useless and will never benefit me later on in life. In fact, I positively know it won't. They should teach us stuff that will help us to succeed in the real world, like your father would say.
Well, you're not wrong about that, son, Mrs. Trellis agreed. I noticed she had a far-away, wistful look in her eyes. Oh, I miss my father dreadfully, she said suddenly, a tear spilling down her cheeks. Goodness gracious me, look at that, a tear, she said, wiping it away. Where on earth did that come from?
Maybe it's 'cause you're sad, Mrs. Trellis. Maybe it's because you're thinking about your dad, and when you think about him, you get all sad. I guess if my dad wasn't around anymore, I'd cry an awful lot.
Well, it never gets easier, you know, Jack. Losing a father, I mean. One day you will know exactly what I'm talking about. My father was a great man, you know. He died over 40 long years ago, would you believe it? And yet a day does not go by when I don't miss him desperately much. He left such an indelible mark on my life, you know. She pointed at the roses and chuckled. I hasten to say, would you believe it, he was more passionate about roses than I actually am. He'd be absolutely devastated if he had insight into how many of these dreadful rose beetles I've had of late. These things know how to decimate all my bushes and make a mockery of the leaves. It never gets any easier, let me tell you. My father always used to say that looking after roses was a labour of love. He wasn't wrong about that.
Well, Miss Trellis, your roses are the most beautiful in our entire street, I admitted.
Less about me, dear, said Mrs. Trellis. You must forgive me, Jack. I do know how to go on and on. My father always used to tell me I talk far too much for my own good. I'm much like my late mother in that regard, I have to say. When I was growing up, she wasn't known as the town gossip for nothing, let me tell you. My mother knew everything that was going on in our small town when I was a girl. And what she didn't know wasn't worth knowing.
I don't think you're a gossip, Mrs. Trellis. You enjoy talking. There's nothing wrong with that.
Well, that's very nice of you to say, Jack. But don't let me keep you. You have a walk you need to be on. How is Lassie doing, by the way? She asked, looking at Lassie, who was wagging her tail furiously and was currently lifting her leg on a tree trunk. She certainly looks happy to be on this walk, I have to say.
Well, she's always happy when we take her for a walk. Well, when I take her for a walk. But she's doing great, Mrs. Trellis. Thank you for asking. You know Lassie. She's always happy. We're on our way to the doggy park, if you must know.
Well, she's a fine-looking dog, Jack, and credit to you for all your training skills, for she's very obedient these days. It's marvellous that you can walk her off the leash. Not everybody can boast about that, you know. Now, you enjoy your walk, will you? Oh, just so you know, Jack, I saw Mr. Lehman a moment ago. He was walking jet ski to the doggy park, down the street, of course. We had a few words together. Turns out he was in a jolly good mood. Apparently he won some money on the horses. I believe he's quite the betting man, is Mr. Lehman. Always been lucky with the horses. And as for that labradoodle of his jet ski, well, like Lassie, he's a delightful dog to behold. But I'm sure you know that already.
So you saw them going to the doggy park? I said, my face suddenly lighting up like a Christmas tree. That's good. Lassie really, really likes jet ski, I said, secretly feeling a sense of unbridled joy in my heart as I thought of a bright future with 8 adorable puppies. And a part of me wanted to gallop down the road as fast as I possibly could to get to the doggy park at record speed. But I willfully restrained myself from such a temptation and smiled warmly at Mrs. Trellis. Lovely seeing you, Mrs. Trellis. Have a great afternoon, I said. I might see you on my walk back home, if you're still attending to your roses, that is.
Now don't let me keep you, dear. Off with you, young man, said Mrs. Trellis, waving her arm. Enjoy your walk, will you? I waved at Mrs. Trellis, who watched me meander down the street, while she continued to spray her roses with her organic insecticide, that she told me once was a combination of garlic and canola oil, which apparently keeps the beetles at bay, as Mrs. Trellis refused to use anything on her plants that was not organic. It was as I was about to cross over to the park on the other side of the road, I suddenly observed a car rolling down the street. It was a red Hyundai, but it all happened very quickly. There was no time for me to study the license plates, and I would have done so had I known it would have been important. The car screeched and came to an abrupt and very sudden stop. The noise was so jarring, and deafening to a certain extent, that I almost jumped out of my skin. A man wearing a pair of khaki shorts and a red golfing top, along with a pair of open sandals that he was wearing with white socks, which my mother always said was a criminal offence. She claimed that men wearing socks with sandals just wasn't allowed as far as she was concerned. Well, the man jumped out of the car. He looked somewhat flustered. He was pointing to the wheel of his car and saying, "This can't be happening. Please, God, no." "Are you all right, sir?" I asked, stopping in my tracks, sensing the man seemed to be in some kind of trouble. I suspected he must have run a flat tire or something, which was why he appeared suddenly very flustered. Maybe he was in a rush to get to an appointment and would likely need to change a tire. My mother would say things like this invariably always happened when you were in a rush. "Whether I'm all right or not, son, is very debatable," said the man. "I think I heard a pop in one of my rear wheels. I hope I'm wrong about this, but I believe I've run over a nail or something. The last thing I need is a flat. Do me a favour, son, won't you? Will you check my rear wheel on the passenger side to see if you can see a nail embedded in the rubber? I'll check the rear wheel on the driver's side. You'll be doing me a big favour." "Sure, sir," I said, eager to be of help. I trotted over to the rear passenger side tyre. I couldn't help but think that both wheels looked absolutely fine. But if the man had heard a pop, it needed investigating. But I thought it was strange that he wouldn't know which wheel it was that had been affected by this so-called nail. I told Lassie to stay on the pavement. "Stay, girl," I said in a stiff command. "I won't be a second, Lassie." Lassie was obediently sitting on the grass, while I trotted over to the rear wheel to examine it more carefully. As I was bending down to examine the rubber tyre, I said, "I don't see anything here, sir." And the next thing I knew, the man had picked up Lassie, thrown him into the back of the car, and driven off with my dog. It happened so very quickly, I don't even think Lassie had time to react. It was such a surreal moment. I was so bemused, so taken aback, that I stared off into the distance, wondering if that had really just happened. This man had abducted my beloved dog, who was my very best friend. Was this even actually happening? Or was this a terrible dream on which I would wake up in any moment? But I realized it had happened, and it was real. I was left feeling completely confounded and absolutely devastated, with a loose lead in my hand, staring ahead of me disbelievingly. As far as I was concerned, Chestnut Hill was a safe suburb in which to live here in Philadelphia, but someone had just had the audacity to steal my beloved dog. Suddenly I wanted to get violently sick, as I was struck with the horrifying realization that I would likely never see Lassie again, and that hit me so brutally hard, like a slab of cement being flung at my head. My worst nightmare had been realized. So there we are, that's the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good